Good evening, I'm Eitan Boritzer, and welcome to our talk, Yoga and the Teachings of the Buddha. Good evening. So, welcome to Teachings of the Buddha with Yoga. And we are going to do an honorific chant, which is just to say, just honoring the Buddha and his teachings, the Blessed One. So it's nothing religious, but I will do it for us and repeat it 3 times quickly, and then we'll get into the talk, all right? Namo tasso bhagavato arahato samsama buddhassa. Namo tasso bhagavato arahato samsama buddhassa. Namo tasso bhagavato arahato samsama buddhassa. Okay. So, you're probably wondering, what are all these books? These are actually books that I've read. And this pile here represents 3 parts of what is called the scriptures, or the canon itself, which are the suttas, which are the discourses of the Buddha that he actually spoke. And there is the Vinaya, which is the rules of the order for the monks and the nuns. And then there is the Abhidhamma, which are called the higher teachings. And there's reputed to be 84,000 suttas, or discourses, and sutta is part of the Pali language which the Buddha spoke, and Pali is a dialect of Sanskrit. There was a high Sanskrit that the priests and the warriors spoke, and then the everyman, the merchants, the 4 castes, the peasants, and the artists would also speak in Pali. So, for instance, the word karma, which you've heard in Pali, is kama. And the word dharma, which you might have heard in Sanskrit, is dhamma. So there are very similar sounds. But what we do know is that Sanskrit and English are part of the same language group. It's called the Indo-English language group. So there are a lot of similarities, and I'll explain why, between these 2 languages. So the word sutta, which means discourse, but which literally means to stitch, is where we get the word sutra. Okay, and so as we go along, I'll try to point out some of the similarities between the words. And as long as we're talking about that, it stems from an invasion that occurred, it is believed, about 1,500 years before the Buddha's birth, so about 2,100 before the Common Era, as it's called now, BCE. There was a movement from what is Northern Europe, where we would say England, Scandinavia is now, the Netherlands, Germany. From there was an invasion over Iran into, through Pakistan, and into what is called the Indus River Valley. In fact, that is where we get the word Hindu, is from the Indus River Valley, the Hindu River Valley. So there is a similarity in this Indian English language group. And so these represent the teachings of the Buddha, and now these represent the teachings, more or less, of yoga. And I will be discussing both, as I said tonight. The Upanishads is part of the Vedas. The Vedas were the system, the Vedic culture was there when these invaders came in, and already the Rig Veda, as it's called, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda and the Sama Veda were in existence. The fourth Veda is called the Upanishads, and that is developed about 500 or 600 years before the Buddha's birth. So I will try to give you some timeline here so we get the context historically, who this man was and in what historical context he actually fits in. We will be talking about the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali, which are called the yoga aphorisms, the Ashtanga system, the 8 limbs of yoga. So we'll be discussing that. The Bhagavad Gita, which is the kernel or one of the most important parts of the Mahabharata, which is the epic poem of India. So we'll be discussing a little bit of that. Shankarya, who was a great non-dualist philosopher, we'll touch on him as well. And the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is the first setting down of Hatha Yoga, which is what we've been doing here in the United States for the last 100 years or so, particularly the last 40 years, this great outgrowth of yoga studios and yoga awareness, and that has become about a $20 billion a year industry in a good old American way. So we'll be discussing how that actually is derived from the Yoga Pradipika, meaning the light on yoga, which was set down by Swatmarama in the 15th century. And so the asanas were described at that time, pranayama was described at that time, and various meditation techniques. So where to begin would be with the history as I was relating it to you 1,500 years before the Buddha's birth. The Buddha is born in 563 BCE, before the Common Era, and lives to around 483 BC, which is about 80 years that he actually lives. Now, moving back in the time history, back to the Aryan invasion, as it's called. The Aryans, which Mr. Hitler took that word, Aryan just means noble ones. And it was the Aryan culture that came through from Northern Europe, and that's where Mr. Hitler relates to the Indian culture, and where, for instance, the swastika is in fact a good fortune sign, and swasti means good fortune, in fact. So he appropriated that symbol, thinking that he was one of the noble ones from that historical era. And it's interesting, when you go to India, you might see what we call the Star of David, which is also an Indian yantra, as it's called, a symbol, and the 6 stars, the 6-pointed star, and within that you'll see a swastika. So it's kind of interesting, you know, if you're coming from a Jewish background, to see that. But you see swastikas all over India today. It's just part of that culture, that it means good fortune, and swasti just means good fortune. So when these Aryan invaders come into India, they already find this very established culture, the Vedic culture. Already the 4 castes are set, that is the Brahmins, who are the priestly caste, the Kshetras, who are the nobility or the warrior caste, and the Vasas, who are the merchant caste, and then there are the Shudras, who are everybody else, the peasants, the workers, the artists, the artisans. And so there is a mixing of cultures between them. And one of the major developments of that mixture of culture is that the Brahmanic, the priestly hold on religious activity starts to get shaken. Now, before the Aryans get there, and for hundreds of years after, actually, if you wanted to make contact with the gods, that is Brahman and Varuna and Pajapati and Soma and these ancient gods, then you had to go through the priests. So you had to pay a lot of gold or cattle, and there would be sacrifices, animal sacrifices, that the priests would make in your name for the things that obviously we want today, 2,600 or 3,100 years ago or 4,000 years ago. People still are wanting help health for their family, longevity, prosperity, all of the things that we pray to, the various gods that we pray to. And so it's interesting to me that those gods are no longer around. The gods of the Hindu religion today are basically Vishnu and Shiva and the various gods and goddesses that come out of those two. But Krishna and Shiva, or Vishnu as an incarnation of Vishnu, Vishnu, Krishna, Rama, Parvati, Saraswati, Kali Durga, none of these gods and goddesses were at that time part of the Vedic culture. So it's interesting to me always how gods come and go when you think of it. The Inca gods have come and gone, the Aztec gods, the Egyptian gods, the Greeks, the Roman gods. And in my opinion, that if we came back here in 500 years, maybe the monotheistic God would no longer be here either, and we would maybe have an alien God or some other kind of God. So what happens is that people get dissatisfied that they have to go through the priests and pay all the money, and there are a lot of people that want to pray to the gods as well, but don't have the gold or the cattle to pay the priests to do these magical incantations that are really what the Vedas are about. Spells and instructions and sacred notes about the gods and mythology about the gods. So what starts to happen is that people literally start to wander out of that society, and they're called wanderers or samanas, and they are seeking to come closer to the gods themselves without the priests. And now at that time, rebirth and all the theories about rebirth and were in existence. And so comes this philosophy that is most personified by the Jains themselves and the Nagathas and various of these wandering groups, whereby the way to come to closer to the gods, or Brahman for instance, is through self-sacrifice. That because we do not have cattle to sacrifice to the gods, that we will sacrifice our own bodies and do penance and self-punishment in order to expiate the bad karma of our past lives and purify ourselves so that we can come finally into union or yoga with the gods. And so various types of asceticisms are developed, and the Buddha himself will also practice these very harsh types of asceticism, which he describes in quite excruciating detail, of eating 1 sesame seed a day, of standing on 1 leg for a day, of standing in the rivers, of pulling out 1 hair of the beard at a time and 1 hair, single strand of hair from the head, and various other types of penances and asceticisms in order to create a purification of the past karmas. And so by doing that, then one would be able to finally purify oneself to come to the same purity as Brahma or the gods. And this is the basic difference between the teachings of the Buddha and the yoga or the Hindu teachings, is this belief in what is called finally the Atman, which is the soul of the person, the individual soul of the person, that which is the spark of Brahman. Brahm means large, man actually means mind, but that's where the English word man comes from. Brahman is the large mind, Atman is the individual mind. And so when the two minds come together in union, which is what yoga means, then there will be a final release and a final coming out of the wanderings or the samsaras of birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth. And so in year 2001, when I was in India, in Allahabad, there is what is called the Kumbh Mela, which is where 10 million Hindus get together at a juncture of the Ganga River, of the Yamuna and the Varuna River, and do all kinds of rituals and pujas, worships, because it's an auspicious time when all of the astrology is lined up correctly. And I saw a documentary on it later on. I didn't see His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he was there. There's a lot going on and a lot of people for about 2 weeks. It's a pretty, if you can imagine, Woodstock times 10, you know? So it was pretty crazy. And but the documentary, the Dalai Lama was there, and he was saying, my brothers, we are all brothers. You, my brothers, you believe in Atman. We you Hindus believe in Atman. We Buddhists, we do not believe in Atman, but we are still all brothers, my brothers. You know, so recognizing that as the basic difference between Hinduism and the teachings of the Buddha, that there is no Atman. And as we go into the teachings themselves, we'll go deeper into how the Buddha actually, in 62 different arguments, in one of the most important discourses called the Brahmajala Sutta, which means the discourse on the great net. And the great net of what? The great net of soul theory. Atman having come to mean soul. And you know that even if you've studied your Old Testament or the New Testament, there's very, very scant reference to soul. Soul is something that is developed later in theory in the Western theology, but there's very little mention even of the word soul. In the Hebrew text, nephesh, which means breath, has sort of come to mean soul. But the Buddha in the Brahmajala Sutta then will, in 62 arguments, destroy soul theory. And it's very hard to argue against the Buddha. The Buddha is a genius, and it's like trying to argue with Albert Einstein. And he was quite radical, and he changed the whole course of Vedic teachings, mainly because of this, destroying the theory of Atman itself, which is what the wanderers, these ascetics, were using as the reason for their penances and for their asceticism. So we'll move forward about 100 years prior, about 600 years prior the Buddha's birth, is formulated this Upanishads. And the Upanishads means the sitting next to, meaning the sitting next to the gods, really. And the priests kind of co-opt what the wanderer's philosophy is. And this is the first time that yoga specifically, meaning the union of Atman and Brahman, is mentioned. So that's the importance of the Upanishads, but it is the fourth and last of the writings that has been codified as part of the canon, the scripture, the Vedic or Hindu scripture. And these Nagathas who I've mentioned, or these Jains who I've mentioned, are doing these practices, and Mahavira, the Jain, great saint of the Jain, sets down all of this philosophy of the expiation of past negative karmas which cause one to rebirth and rebirth and rebirth, and the way to come out of that is through, as I said, these practices. The Buddha is born into, as Siddhartha Gautama in the province of Sakya, which is in the north part of India, where is now the Nepalese and Indian border. And he is a prince born to one of the court princes, and he is told, his father is told by one of these wandering samanas that by fortune telling that your son will either be a great universal monarch or a great earthly monarch. Earthly monarch being a king, and universal monarch being a great spiritual leader of sorts. So the father, not wanting his son to become a wanderer, then builds 3 palaces for him, and he is raised in great luxury and great pleasure, a hedonistic kind of lifestyle. And as it's told traditionally, he at one point leaves the palace and he sees a dead person. He asks the charioteer, what's that? And because he's never seen a dead person, the father has kept him only in this pleasure domes, one for each season, the 3 seasons. And he says, that's a dead person. And what is a dead person? Well, that's what happens to all of us. We die. And he's horrified, the future Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and he sees a person who's ill on the street another time, and he has never seen illness, and he's mortified by that, and he's never seen an old person, so he gets to understand illness, old age, and death. At that time, he is married to his 16-year-old bride, and they have a 2-year-old son, and he determines that how can I live in this kind of pleasure dome and this pleasure society, and people in these palaces are acting like old age, illness, and death don't exist, but yet it's so horrifying, and they're just dancing and singing and eating nice food. And he determines that he will leave and that he will find what he calls the deathless state. The state, the unconditioned state, the state that goes beyond illness, old age, and death, the deathless state. And he becomes one of these wanderers. He has 2 teachers, and they take him through various levels of meditative absorptions. So he does develop certain kinds of spiritual powers, and he, for 6 years, is wandering and practicing these asceticisms to the point where at one time he is with 5 friends and he's practicing, and he says that at that time my eyes had blackened, all the hair on my head was gone, the skin of the front of my body was sticking to the ribs of the back of my body. He was not in good shape. And through these asceticisms, and eschewing at that time, of course, all pleasure was to be denied, and only this kind of harsh practice. For instance, they would sit in the sun, called the 5 fires, because tapas, meaning fire, was a way of purifying oneself, was burning out impurities. So they would make 4 fires, one in either direction, and the sun would be the 5th. And if you've ever been to India and you sit out in the sun in the middle of the day, it's very hot, so you don't need extra heat there. But so these kinds of asceticisms he was practicing, and no pleasure, of course, and no pleasure objects. So he comes to a realization while he's practicing with 5 friends of his, 5 cohorts of his by the river, these asceticisms, trying to create this union, this yoga. He determines that a thought comes to his mind while he's meditating, saying, why am I afraid of pleasure? Why am I afraid of pleasure? And the obvious reason is because pleasure is an attractor, and then you will continue to, and you will attach to your pleasures, and you will continue in these cycles of birth and rebirth. But he recalls that he had a great episode of pleasure when he was an infant. He had been placed by the side of a tree in a field while there was a ritual going on to initiate the plowing season, and his father and the workers were doing some ceremony. He had gone into an ecstatic state while he was an infant, and he recalled this as an infant. And traditionally it's said that when his father and the workers came back, Siddhartha was sitting in the meditative posture, and they realized that he would be a great spiritual leader. So he recalls this pleasure incident, but he says, but that pleasure was not dependent on anything. That was a spontaneous pleasure. Could there be that kind of pleasure that is not attached to any conditionality or dependent on any conditions, whereby one could still attain union or yoga? So just at that moment, while this is going through his mind, a young goat herd appears and she offers him some rice porridge. So he takes this milk and rice porridge, and his 5 friends who are practicing asceticism see and say, oh, you see, Gautama is going back to the life of pleasure. He's going to the life of luxury because he's taken some milk and porridge. And so they desert him, and at that night is when he has his night of enlightenment. And in the first watch of the night, he sees all of his past lifetimes. He sees hundreds of thousands. At such a time, my name was such and such. These were my parents. I lived in this town. I lived in this city. At that time, my name was such and such. And there is a book called the Jataka Tales, which was written in about the 1st century of the Common Era, about 400 years after the Buddha's death, that recounts 500 of his past lifetimes. Now, of course, these are all fictional, it's understood. But they're very interesting in that how does one go from lifetime to lifetime to become a Buddha, in other words. And so there are stories like when he was incarnated as a rabbit, he was hopping around in the forest and he came across a hunter who was dying of starvation and had a little fire going as he was dying, and the future Buddha, as a rabbit, jumped in the fire so that this hunter would have something to eat. So he sacrifices, the ultimate sacrifice, one's life. And so through various, as a monkey god, as another type of a prince, you have these interesting stories which all end as him sacrificing his life for someone else, literally. But that's just fictional, okay? But he sees his own lives. It's not described what he sees. And in the second watch of the night, he sees karma as it's played out with other people. He sees the comings and goings of those who are beautiful, those who are ugly, those who are healthy, those who are maimed. He sees all types of karma. And at that time is when he starts to understand what is called Paticca Samuppada, which is the chain of causation of how karma works, how one goes from lifetime to lifetime through dependent conditions, conditionalities. And maybe I'll just divert right here just to explain this very important tenet, or this very important concept of the Buddha, which is Paticca Samuppada. And the way, if you know Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese monk, he has an interesting way of explaining it. He'll hold up a white sheet of paper, just a piece of stationery, and he'll say, "Do you see the cloud in the sheet of paper?" And of course you don't see a cloud in a blank sheet of paper, but because of dependent origination, you understand that that sheet of paper came from being mashed up together, pieces of wood, right, pulp, and that pulp came from a tree that was cut down by a lumberjack, and that tree was grown because of the soil and because of the sunlight and because of the rain and because of the clouds. So that's how you see the clouds in a sheet of paper. The Buddha himself said all conditions are dependent on prior conditions. So, for instance, a fire is dependent on some wood. Okay, and then again, the wood is dependent on all of the conditions prior to that. Now, how does that relate to the Buddha seeking the deathless state? That is what he is seeking, the deathless state. And he understands how death comes about by understanding what is the precondition for illness, old age, and death. What is the precondition for death? And very simply put, that is birth. Something can't die unless it was born. So that is the dependent condition for the condition of death. And what is the condition for birth? And that would be gestation, or bhavana, which is called becoming. And what is the condition for becoming? Because becoming arises from some dependent condition, and that comes from upada, which means clinging or attaching. Even a fetus has to attach to something in order for it to go through the gestation process. And then what is clinging dependent on? Clinging is dependent on desire. One has to have a desire to cling onto something. And what is desire dependent on? Desire is dependent on a feeling. One has to, let's say I want that red Ferrari because it makes me feel so good, you know, so I'm going to attach to the idea of getting myself that Ferrari. It makes me feel good. I get good sensations mentally. I even feel it in my body. It's so exciting, that idea, right? And so what is that feeling or sensation dependent on is contact. In other words, one has to have contact with the object that one is getting a feeling for. So I have contact, let's say, with my eye sees the form of that car, and out of that arising a feeling like, whoa, excitement, and then attaching to the idea I'm going to, having the desire, and then attaching to that desire. And then what is that contact dependent on? Making visual contact is dependent on the six sense bases, meaning the eye consciousness, or the eye organ, which are called the six sense bases. And in the West, we have what we call five senses, but in the Buddhist teaching, the sixth sense is the mind itself. Because as you are apprehending, let's say, forms with the eyes, or sounds, or voices, or noises with the ear organ, so with the mind organ, you are apprehending pleasant thoughts or unpleasant thoughts, and it's not dependent on anything. You could just have your eyes closed and just thinking stuff that makes you feel good or makes you not feel good. So we have to have these receptors, basically, the six sense bases. And what are those dependent on? That is dependent on the nama rupa, which is a mind body. You have to have a mind body in order for the receptors to be attached to something. And when we say in the yoga class, namaste, we're referring to the nama, which is the more mental or mind energy side, and rupa, the more dense or bodily energy side of things. And what is then the mind body dependent on? Consciousness itself. So one has to have a certain amount of consciousness for the body to be active, for a body to arise. First is consciousness itself. And so what is consciousness dependent on? Consciousness is then dependent on what is called the sankharas, which are the formations. And in modern terms, what formations, and this was one of the genius of the Buddha, is that he understood DNA. He understood the algorithms way ahead of the geneticists today. He understood that there are programs downloaded to us by our parents, by the society. There are various types of what are called formations already embedded in us when we take on consciousness, before we take on consciousness, before we take on a body, etc., before we get ears. So there is what is called the sankharas, and this is a kind of a subtle concept to grasp, but it could be called the collective unconscious, as Jung called it. Everything that's already out there is already inside of us as well. And so what are these formations or sankharas dependent on? And that is ignorance. If there is no knowledge, ignorance being the opposite of knowledge, then nature abhorring a vacuum, as we say. There is a fill-in to that kind of ignorance or emptiness. Where it comes from, how it comes from is not really explained, but this is what the dependent condition is for formations. So you might think, where does the fetus get consciousness, or at what point does it have, or the embryo or the zygote, at what point is there actually consciousness of sorts, or formations that have been downloaded in there? We don't know. And then, of course, a question here that you might ask, so I'll ask it for you now, is what is ignorance dependent on? Because there is only 12 parts of this chain of causation that the Buddha describes, and he'll answer to you that that is based on the 5 hindrances. And what are the 5 hindrances? These are sensuality, anger, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and doubt. So if you have those kinds of characteristics, or you're activating those kinds of characteristics, then you are moving into an ignorant state of ignorance. And then the whole chain of causality begins. And then, of course, your next question is, what are the 5 hindrances dependent on? And those are dependent on the 10 fetters. So I'm not going to go into everything right now, because we don't have all night to do this, but just to make you understand that in Western theology, for instance, or even, you know, Stephen Hawkins is talking to the Dalai Lama, and he's saying, well, we have this Big Bang theory, you know, where there was nothing and then spontaneously there was matter. And the Dalai Lama says, well, that's your theory, and our theory is this: dependent origination. You know, and we cannot ask Western theologians the question, what was God doing before he said, let there be light? Was he having tea in the garden? What was he doing? You know, there had to be some condition which we cannot ask Western theologians, because they will have no answer to it. Okay, and but the Dalai Lama and the Buddhists have the answer that there are various contractions and expansions of the physical and mental realities called vasanas over eons and eons. And what is an eon? Because the Buddha is a genius, he tells you what is an eon. And it's very interesting. He gives an example. Imagine, if you will, a mountain made out of iron. And this mountain is 8 miles high, 8 miles wide, and 8 miles deep. Now, every 100 years, a man comes with a silk handkerchief, and he just rubs on that mountain for a little while, and then he leaves. He comes back another 100 years, rubs the mountain. The amount of time that it would take that man with his silk handkerchief to rub down that iron mountain would be 1 eon. And he gives various examples of what an eon is. So when you're dealing on the level of a Buddha, you know, there are mind-blowing concepts that come up. And that's the idea, perhaps, is to blow our minds out of our accepted or downloaded perceptions. So this is in the second watch of the night, the second 3 hours of the night, and then the second 2 hours of the night, and then the last 2 hours of the night, what he calls the destruction of the taints, or the asavas, happen. And there are 3, well, asavas have been translated in different ways, as floods, as distillations, as taints. And what it means is just whatever residue is left of what might be called impurity or attachment. And he destroys any last vestiges of attachments. And the 3 taints are kama, which is sensuality, attachment to sensuality. And understanding, again, sensuality involves the 6 sense bases. Okay, you could be attached to something visual, you could be attached to your collection of Mozart records, you know, you could be attached to olfactory your taste buds. You could be attached to tactile sensations. All the different, so kama meaning sensuality does not mean sexuality, okay? You could be attached to brilliant ideas that you love, and you just cannot detach yourself from all the brilliance of your own mind and all the ideas that are going on in there, the mental attachments. And the second is bhavana, the second taint, which means becoming. This idea that things are evolving and that there will be births and rebirths. So giving up your attachment to your own evolvement even, or your own becoming, or what is you believe coming to be. And then the third the third taint is ignorance itself. And so one destroys ignorance through knowledge. The opposite of ignorance is knowledge. And Buddha actually means one who knows. Bodhi just means knowledge. But knowing at the deepest level, and in the Pali, Yata Bhuta Jana Dasana, meaning to know things as they are, direct knowledge of knowing things as they are, not reading about them, not hearing about them, but direct experience of knowing things as they are. And the word jnana, which is in there, means an absorption. So that one, in the sense of knowledge, means to become absorbed. So in order to know something, let's say there's a flower in front of me or a flower in the field, and I just want to know that flower, I come closer, walk closer to that flower, then I put my eye right on that flower, then I get a magnifying glass to get closer and become more absorbed into that thing. And of course the best way to know that thing would be to become the flower, to become completely absorbed into the flower. So to know things as they are means to be absorbed into the knowing things as they are, but at the deepest level. And so he sits at the Bodhi tree, the tree of knowledge, basically. Which is very different than the Western theology, as we know. When you read Genesis and you realize that when the serpent is speaking to Eve, he's asking her, do you know why God forbade you to eat from the apple of the tree of knowledge? Do you know why? And he says the reason why is because God knows that when you eat of that tree, you will become like him and you will have his wisdom. And that's verboten. That's a no-no, to know what God knows, to have full knowledge. So, and this is one of the main differences, of course, in Buddhism, that the Buddha wants you to not have faith in the teachings, okay? When you take refuge in the triple gem, that is the Buddha, the Dharma, which is the teachings of the law, and the Sangha, which is the order. When you take refuge, or you have faith in that, your sadhana, meaning faith, he explains that faith is not what we consider blind faith, okay? That faith is based on what? It's based on scrutiny and investigation. So he wants you to have knowledge. Don't take it on my say-so. Investigate me, the teacher. Scrutinize me, the teacher. And when he says scrutinize me, being the genius and having 45 years after his enlightenment, at age 35, he preaches for 45 years after his enlightenment. He develops the Vinaya, which is the rules of the order, the 250 rules of the order, and the first 5 rules of the order, which are abstain from killing, abstain from taking what is not given, abstain from sexual misconduct, abstain from false speech, divisive speech, harsh speech or babble, abstain from intoxicants. So those are the first 5 precepts that anyone who follows the Buddha as a lay person or as a nun or as a monk has to adhere to. The first 5 is different than the first 10 commandments. Actually, if you go to Exodus 20, you'll see that there's actually 17 commandments. The first 6 or 7 are about, thou shalt have no other God before me, thou shalt not take my name in vain. It's all about God and his vainglory. Okay, and then we get to thou shalt not kill, which is actually number 8 in the list of about 17. So when you're investigating and scrutinizing in order to have faith in the Buddha, you're looking at the teacher and you're saying, does he abstain from killing? Does he abstain from taking what is not given? Does he abstain from sexual misconduct? Does he abstain from false speech, divisive speech, harsh speech, babble? And there's, in the long discourses, there is about 3 pages of what the Buddha considers babble. Okay, and that would be talks about kings, talks about shows that you went to, because of course they had music, they had theater, they had plays and dance, of course, talking about the weather, talking about death, talking about whether we exist or whether we don't exist, talking about clothing, talking about housing. Those are the lists of babble. Does the teacher abstain from talking babble, and does the teacher abstain from intoxicants? You're scrutinizing and investigating. Now, okay, yes, I think I do have faith in this guy because I've investigated him. Now I'm going to look at his followers. Do they abstain from killing? Do they abstain? You see? So now I'm scrutinizing them. Now I'm looking at his teachings. Does he teach abstain from killing? Does he teach this? Yes. So you have confidence, and so you're getting faith in the Buddha. So all of this is to talk about what a Buddha is, what the word Buddha means, and he now is coming out of his night of enlightenment. And it should be understood that the Vedics were not monotheists, they were polytheists. Okay, so as I mentioned, the names of the different gods and the offshoots and the consorts and the sons and the daughters of these particular gods and goddesses. So they were not monotheists, they were polytheists. And the Buddha understood that there were what are called formless beings out there, and beings that have different levels of what are called merit and accomplishment. So as one moves out of the human cycle into more celestial beings, what are called the devas, or the divas, which of course is where we get the word diva, a goddess, or gods, and the word divine, which it comes from deva, divine. We are seeing that these gods and goddesses are formless beings. They no longer are dependent on the nutrients that we're dependent on for the physical body, the air, the water, the food. The 4 nutrients are including with contact that we're on with consciousness and with the sankharas. Those are what the Buddha calls the 4 nutrients that these humans are dependent on. And so these formless beings who have developed into gods and goddesses, how? Through what is called merit and accomplishment. So merit, it means doing good karmas, okay? And accomplishment really means developing the concentrative abilities, developing the abilities of concentration itself. So it's nice if you're a good person and you will reap the vipaka phala, the resultant fruits of your good karmas. And what are the karmas? They are 3 karmas. There is mental karma, which the Buddha calls the most important of actions. Karma meaning action is the mental action. Everything proceeds. As we see, you know, this book proceeded from a mental, this clock proceeded from an idea, a mental idea. This table, this chair, everything proceeds from mental karma, mental actions, verbal actions, and physical actions. And so, I'm diverting from the diversion, so I may get lost from time to time, so bear with me, because it's hard to really talk about this in a kind of a linear fashion. I mean, we're trying to do this chronologically by his life, and then we'll intersperse later how through the yoga practices and the yoga philosophies, there's a separation and a mixture through them. But now these Devis and Devas, these gods and goddesses, see that there is a Buddha. And if you've ever been to India, you may find a Baba in every village. You may find a Bhagavan. You may find a guru. You may even find an avatar, you know, a savior. But you will never find a Buddha. Nobody will call himself a Buddha, okay? Because that is the superlative of superlatives, and you better have your stuff together if you're going to call yourself a Buddha. So the gods and the goddesses, even though the Buddha is sitting alone through this night, having his night of enlightenment, the gods and the goddesses are seeing what's going on with this being, and as he's coming out of this night of enlightenment, he thinks to himself, well, this is it. Or in the Buddha, I should say it in the Buddhist terms, the Buddha's refrain is, birth has been destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done was done, there is no more beyond this. Okay, meaning that birth and rebirth have been destroyed. I'm in the deathless state. There is no more death. There is no rebirth to me. I have destroyed death, obliterated, eradicated death. So he finds the deathless state. And these gods and goddesses are witnessing this. And as he's coming out of this, he's thinking to himself, well, I've done it. I've destroyed it. I've reached the goal after 6 years, after all these asceticisms. He didn't have a day job, right? That was his day job. Or as famous Guru Muktananda said, meditation was my occupation. Okay, that's all he did. But it took him 6 years, which is a short time, to come to a full liberation the way he has come. And he thinks to himself, there's nothing else to do. And he starts wandering off towards the Himalayas. And the gods are concerned about this because they want him to teach. Even the gods and the goddesses need to be taught, because even though they have reached a higher state of awareness or higher state where they don't need a body anymore, they're still in the cycle of birth and rebirth, because there's still attachments that they have attached to, but they may have detached from the bodily attachments, but there are subtler and subtler attachments that I'll relate to you in a moment. And so they send down one of the gods, Pajapati, in the guise of a wanderer, of one of these ascetics, and he says, but Lord, you cannot leave because you must teach. And the Buddha says, well, there's no one to teach. There's no one who's interested in what I know. I can't explain it, and in this generation, there's no one who wants these teachings anyway. And Pajapati, as the ascetic, says, but wait, look around. There may be, use your divine eye, there may be some people who still have only a little dust left on their eyes. So you could help those, you could teach those people. And he says, well, I don't know anyone like that. And Pajapati says, what about your two teachers? So he looks with his divine eye, but they have passed away just recently to his enlightenment. And he says, well, they're gone and I have nobody else. He said, well, what about your 5 friends, you know? And he sees the 5 friends are in Varanasi. and they're still doing their asceticisms. And he says, very well, for the sake of these 5, I will stay and I will teach. And so before that, he wanders towards Gaya, and you've heard of Bodhi Gaya, where supposedly that tree is that he sat under, but it's historically inaccurate because all of these ascetics sat under a tree. So it didn't necessarily wasn't that particular tree, but they all sat under a tree and went into these meditative states. That was considered their lodging, was the foot of a tree. And then eventually he wanders after some time down to Varanasi, which is just southeast of where Delhi is today. And that city has been there. And if you go to India, you must go to Varanasi. That is the holiest city in India. And which is called the city of Shiva, because many people go there to die. And Shiva is the god of destruction and rebirth in that regard. Kali Shiva, his consort, is the energy of primordial rebirth. And people go there to die, and that's where all the cremation ghats are. And the Hindus believe if you die and cremated in Varanasi, then you will be liberated at death. So it's quite an interesting place to visit. I recommend it. And he meets his 5 friends there, and they see him coming, and they say, oh, here comes Gautama. Don't talk to him. He's into luxury, and we don't want to speak with him at all. But of course, when he comes, they welcome him, and they give him a seat, and they give him some water to wash his feet. And they say to him, after he settles down, they say to him, friend Gautama, what have you learned? They see there's a change in him. His skin is golden, he's walking differently, there's a whole demeanor about him that's different. And so they say, what have you learned, friend Gautama? And he says, don't call me friend anymore. Call me the Tathagata. Now the Tathagata is a title that means one who has come from there, one who has thus come. And when you go to India, you will never meet someone who calls himself the Tathagata, just like you will never meet a Buddha today. And so he turns the wheel of Dhamma, as it's called. It is the first turning of the wheel of the teachings themselves. And he teaches these 5 ascetics what he has learned through his night of enlightenment. And the stainless vision of the Dhamma arises in them. They understand the teachings, and they are also at that time liberated. Not as a Buddha, not as a great universal monarch and teacher, but as liberated beings. And so that begins the teaching of the Buddha, and over those next 45 years, many interesting narratives happen, miracles that he performs, which we're not going to really discuss tonight. His own cousin tries to murder him a few times, and kings and queens come to receive the teachings, and wealthy merchants come, and students come, and other priests come, and other Brahmins come to learn the teachings of the Buddha, because there's only one Buddha. And people hear, there is a Buddha. Really? There is a Buddha? Well, let's go visit him, and let's ask him some questions, and let's debate with him. Because at that time, all of these groups, all of these sanghas who are led by various teachers who have 300-400 followers, the Buddha has thousands of followers at this time, they are having a little problem with their sponsor, this king or that minister or that wealthy merchant or landowner, because he has been supporting them, feeding them and giving them clothes. These particular Jains who are performing their asceticisms and are looked at as holy men themselves, and there are women, of course, in the movement. So when they meet the Buddha, who, being the genius that he is and having attained the state of knowledge that he has attained cannot really argue with him the Hindu arguments of the yoga of Brahman and Atman and the path to the union, because what he's preaching is so different than what they are espousing and what they're practicing, and the kings and the queens and wealthy landowners, etc., who are intelligent people, are swayed by the Buddha's arguments and give up feeding the other holy people, or these Jains and these other, and so there's a bit of anger and jealousy that develops, and so more and more they come to attack him, not necessarily physically, but in debate, and no one can defeat this particular person. So just to really fast forward to his 80th year, and it is important to understand this as we get into the teachings itself, that the final words of the Buddha are, all compounded entities are subject to dissolution. Strive arduously. All compounded entities are subject to dissolution. Strive arduously. And that is sort of a paraphrase. What it really means in the Pali is everything that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. Everything that is subject to arising is subject to passing away. Meaning all phenomena, all compounded entities are subject to dissolution. And so we can begin, it's getting a little late, but we have 45 minutes, so I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. And now getting into the teachings of the Buddha himself. And now it is one place that we can begin is what is called the Tilaksanas, which are the 3 characteristics of existence. And so the first characteristics of existence that he gives is anicca, which means impermanence, and then anatta, which means no self, and then the third, dukkha, which means suffering. So when he is speaking of impermanence, he is talking about all sounds are impermanent. All objects that are connected to contact with the sense basis are impermanent. All forms, all colors, all visuals, impermanent. All sounds, all noises, all voice, all tastes, all tactile sensations, all olfactory sensations, smells, subject to arising, passing away. Everything is impermanent. All conditions are subject on prior conditions, impermanent, passing away. All conditions are compounded, okay? Whatever it is, if there's an accident on the road, there's a number of parts to that condition we call there was an accident on the road, and there are a number of elements to that particular condition. All conditions, all phenomena, all things, all events, subject to dissolution. I mean, we could take this book, now we call it a book, and then we could smash it up, or we could leave it out in the sun and it starts to disintegrate back into its paper, into its elemental form of wood, of fiber, of carbon, of oxygen, of water, etc. All is impermanent. Now, one of the things that that Thich Nhat Hanh says that I like also is that it is not difficult to understand the concept of impermanence. We all can understand it. What is difficult is to act as if you understand it. See? So the action of it, meaning that I love my wife, you know, but knowing at the same time my wife is impermanent, this condition that we have, together. This love condition is impermanent, but yet I will cling on to it. Yet I will do everything I can to maintain it, and to feed it, to nourish it, etc. So we act as if we don't understand impermanence. And well, go ahead. We're going to avoid questions, but go ahead, give it to me quickly.
Okay. You said all things are included and strive out.
Yes.
What was he trying to impress upon us to strive out?
Strive arduously. And the answer to that is to know things as they are. Strive arduously to know things as they are. Okay? So in the yoga teachings, so for instance, in the later 15th century, and this we introduced, the Yoga Pradipika, to come to a liberation state, to know things as they are, one does intense asana, intense pranayama, intense physical purifications, tapas, okay? And that intense yoga, as we know it today, hatha yoga, meaning sun, moon, the equilibrium between positives and negatives, the dualities, that will lead us to the yoga. That's not what the Buddha is teaching when he says strive arduously. He says know things as they are. He doesn't say go do some tapas, go do some asceticism. And that is why the Buddha's way is called the Madhyamika, the middle way, which means between torturing oneself, physical, mental, or between the life of luxury. So one tries to find that middle way in order to know things as they are, but one needs to put in great effort, great intention, and we'll come to this as well. So it is not about doing the hatha yoga to purify oneself. And in the teachings of Shankaracharya, who comes in the 8th century of the Common Era, it is this concept of non-duality that comes on, that there is Atman and Brahman and yoga, and that is reality, and the duality is everything else that is not Brahman and Atman, and the ignorance of not knowing, and you have this dualistic world. So it becomes more a philosophy of non-dualism, which is the Advaita philosophy. And in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the 8th century, also the Mahabharata, the Krishna, who is the charioteer of Arjuna, I don't know who's familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, because I may have to run through it very quickly. It is the Mahabharata is the epic poem of India, wherein the Pandavas are a large family that finds itself at war with hundreds of uncles and brothers and cousins on one side, and other cousins and uncles and brothers and sons and daughters on the other side. And they're on this field of Kukshetra, and Krishna, the god, is the charioteer for Arjuna, who is one part of the Pandavas, and the other side of the Pandavas just have a very large host. And so Arjuna looks out and he sees this battlefield, and he sees his uncles, he sees his cousins, he sees his family there, and he says to Krishna, the god, he says, how can I fight this battle? Because if I win, I will kill my uncles and my cousins and my family, and if I don't fight, or if I lose, they will kill me and they will kill their brothers and uncles and cousins on our side. And he says, I'm not fighting. And Arjuna tells him that you must fight, that this is where your actions have brought you, and that to think that you will die, or that your uncles will die, or that anyone here has ever died or will ever die is incorrect. That we have eternal life, and that there is this Atman that just keeps moving from lifetime to lifetime, and that our actions bring us here, and that we cannot stop at this point, that we need to fulfill our karmas, and that there is this yoga that happens either through what he calls karma yoga, which is doing good deeds, or bhakti yoga, which is worshiping God, which are the Hare Krishnas, who are worshiping and singing and laying fruits and prasad, holy food, in front of the images of Krishna. There's Jnana Yoga, which is what Shankaracharya is practicing, the yoga of knowledge. There's Raja Yoga, which is what Patanjali himself is advocating, this path of meditation itself. But you must fulfill your duties wherever you are, and to think that there is going to be any death here is part of your ignorance. And he explains eternity and the Brahmanic reality with Atman. This is not what the Buddha teaches. This is what Hindus are teaching. So there is this impermanence, and that there will be this dissolution of the body, dissolution of the mind, dissolution of the self itself, dissolution of the chair, etc. One understands that by not clinging to compounded entities, and understanding at the deepest level to know things as they are through direct knowledge and acting as if one knows what they are, not just on an intellectual basis. That one does not cling on to anything pleasurable, or people cling to things that are not pleasurable too, as you know. You know, people cling to their neuroses. They cling to things they don't like. Their cigarettes, okay, their alcohol. They know things are bad for them. It's not that they don't know that cigarettes are bad for you, but they cling to things that they know are bad for them. So one can cling to things that one feels pleasurable or one knows are painful. And so one has to act as if one understands this concept of impermanence, that any kind of clinging will then continue the cycle of birth and rebirth, death after death after death. And it is interesting also that death himself appears to the Buddha numerous times. And the Night of Enlightenment, one of the first visitors, even before Pajapati gets there, is death. Mara, as he's called. Mara comes to visit the Buddha and says, "Congratulations, sir, you've done it. You know, you've passed through and you are finished with life, you're finished with rebirth. Why don't you come to my kingdom and enjoy yourself now and have all the pleasures that you want? Because you're liberated, you're no longer clinging to anything. So come, enjoy everything. Here are my daughters, enjoy them." And the Buddha says, "I know you, you're death. Death means rebirth. I will not come to your kingdom, because that will mean I will be back in the cycle of birth and rebirth." And so in the same sense that we see in the teachings of Jesus, where he's tempted by Shaitan, who says, take life, take pleasure, take attachment, right? And Jesus says. So the second Laksana, or the mark of existence, is called not self. And this is the one that is true anathema to Western theologians and to the Hindus in a certain way, although they're more tolerant than the Western theologians, is the idea that there actually is no intrinsic reality, and how that is to the so-called self. Okay, the atta is the individual. Atman is translated as the soul. So first, he destroys the self. He says the self is a compounded entity, what you call me, myself, I, mine. And what is this compounded entity, the self? It is comprised of the 5 aggregates. The first aggregate is the physical form, which is comprised of the earth element, the water element, fire element, air element. So we are comprised of these 4 great elements. And so if one really comes to know things as they are, in the physical material form of what I am, and is truly not dependent or not clinging to anything, pleasurable or not pleasurable, he says in the what is called the great dissertation on the SAW, SAW, he says if there are some brigands or some criminals that come at you and they have a wooden stick, a cudgel as it's called, and they start beating you over the head with this wooden stick, if you had true knowledge, knowing things as they are, you would think to yourself, earth element, the wood, is hitting earth element, the hard element of my skull. The bones, anything in the body that is hard is considered earth element. All the different liquids, we're 75% liquids, all the different liquids in our body are considered water element. The fire element, all the acids, the heat of the body, 98 degrees hot in the body right now, so there's a lot of heat, and the air element itself. So one who has knowledge will understand earth element, the wood stick, is meeting earth element, and that's all that's happening. If you were to get angry at that moment, or if you were to get fearful at that moment, or if you were to get violent at that moment, you will not have understood the teachings. You are not a person of knowledge at that point. Remember, the Buddha is a genius. He's very severe, and he's beyond the edge, okay? And he's mind-blowing. And in the same way, with the four elements of what this comprised five aggregates is, if these criminals come and they push your head underwater and they're drowning you, you'll not get angry. You'll be thinking, water element is meeting water element. That's all that's happening here. And if they throw you in a fire, fire element meeting fire element. If they throw you off a cliff, air element meeting air element. That is to know things as they are and understand impermanence, and where we're going into not self. That this compounded entity, the first aggregate is the material form. The second aggregate is what is called the Vedana, which are the feelings or sensations, not feelings in sad, happy, those are mental sensations, but all sensations external through the sense organs and all sensations internally. So when you're coming to my yoga class, as some of you have come, that is what we are practicing. We're practicing awareness, external, internal sensations on the body. So as it gets hotter in the room, moisture is getting on the skin, heat is rising, and whatever else, stretching you're feeling in the body or sensations in the body. So that group of sensations is the second aggregate, pleasant or unpleasant sensations. Clinging, attaching to those, or not attaching to those. Liberation is when one does not attach to the pleasant or the unpleasant. So we do that one posture, Vajrasana, where we have our toes tucked underneath us and we're just sitting on the heels. And some people feel a lot of pain, or sensation we call it, not pain, sensation in the toes. But that's all it is. Are you identifying with that sensation? What is feeling that sensation? Okay? And the Buddha says there is nothing feeling that sensation. Sensations are just sensing. Sensations are just sensationing, basically. He's saying there is no intrinsic person in charge here. Because if you were this body, you would be able to say, my body be such and such, my body not be such and such. Well, you say this is my body. Yeah, this is me, see? Well, if this was you, then you could change it to what you want, or you could change it to what you don't want. And if these were your feelings, you could change those feelings. Let my feelings be thus, he says. Let my feelings not be thus. Okay? So this sense of ownership, where's your owner? If you are the owner, can you not do something with your property? That would be an assumption in the definition of ownership. And so the third aggregate is called the perceptions group, the sana group, and that is the valuations that we put upon the perception. Okay? So there may be a noise, a high-pitched noise outside there, and I apprehend that noise, and I perceive it and judge it to be a fire engine. And then I feel, my feeling perceptions say, ugh, I don't like that sound. Or a young child goes, I love that sound. Right? So the perception group is where the recognition is of what that sound is, what I'm looking at. I cognize that and I value that. I create a value on that. It's called in modern philosophy the fact-value dichotomy. You perceive this particular clock and you put a value on that clock. Or you see this object and you cognize it as a... So that's the perception group. You know, I'm Italian, that's why I love wine. I'm Chinese, that's why I love rice. All of these connections, etc., evaluations. And then we go into the consciousness aggregate itself, which... Now, we throw this word consciousness around quite a lot, right? And no one, if you ask somebody what does consciousness mean, the Buddha does have a definition because, again, he's the genius, the Buddha. So he's got to define everything. There is no blind faith. There's continuous knowledge, knowing things as they are. Okay, so please, you're the teacher. Tell me, what is consciousness? So the Buddha will say, consciousness is based on the sense receptors themselves, the 6 sense bases. You have ear consciousness. You have olfactory consciousness. You have taste consciousness. You have visual consciousness. You have tactile consciousness. You have mental consciousness. You could be dreaming and you're conscious of the dream. Okay, there's nothing happening on the 5 senses. So that is how he defines consciousness. And again, if you were to say, this is my consciousness, this is my consciousness, you would say, well, let my consciousness be thus. Let me hear like a dog hears. In other words, I understand dogs can hear various pitches that humans can hear. And I understand that on the light spectrum, we have the infrared and the ultraviolet. But we humans can't see that. I would like to see that. These are my eyes, right? So why can't I see that if they're my eyes? Are they your eyes that you can have that this way or that way? Let me not see that accident, or etc. And then we go on to the 4th aggregate. That was the 4th aggregate, the consciousness group. And then the 5th aggregate is what is called the sankharas, which I've mentioned as the formations themselves. This is the DNA, the download itself. And again, what I was saying previously, why I like wine is, hey, I'm Italian. Italians love wine, you know? And people identify with their downloads. That's what a woman feels. I'm a woman, and that's what women feel. You see, and you identify with your program, and your program is the reaction itself. Okay? These are your proclivities. Okay, this is what you tend to like or tend to dislike. You can't even explain why you like a green blouse, you know, or why you like a blue shirt. These are just your choices, and you can't really explain why you like these things, but there is a program, an algorithm that has been developed, you know, from the parents usually, and from the collective unconscious, or from the church that you were taken to when you were 2 years old and you don't even remember what they told you there, but you do, etc. And so he was a psychologist. He was called the great physician. He was a psychologist before Freud and Jung came around even. He understood these programs, as I'm calling them, formations as they're defined. And now he says, this is not the self. And so the yogis, the Vedics, say, well, yeah, we understand that. That's not that hard to understand. But there is an Atman. There is a soul. And the Buddha will say, Well, my good sir, have you ever seen the soul? Has your teacher ever seen the soul? Have the sages that your teachers follow ever reported that they have seen the soul? Well, how can you say there is a soul if no one's even seen it? It's as if, he gives a simile, it's as if you're saying, I'm in love with the most beautiful woman in the land. And someone will say, well, my good man, what is the name of this woman? Well, I don't know. What does she look like? I don't know. I've never seen her. Well, who is her family? I don't know. I've never met them. Well, how can you be in love with the most beautiful woman in the land? You don't know who she is. And does the soul have feelings? Is the soul happy? Is the soul unhappy? If the soul has feelings, okay, sensations, which are impermanent, how can you say that the soul is permanent? Is the soul eternal? Okay, and he will say, how do you know that the soul is eternal? But he'll give you a choice. Is the soul eternal, or is the soul not eternal? Is the soul both eternal and not eternal? Or is the soul neither eternal nor not eternal? Okay, is the soul infinite, or is the soul not infinite? Is the soul both infinite and non-infinite? Or is the soul neither infinite nor not infinite? So he'll give you a choice. Which is your choice? And how do you know that? Please explain to me, how do you know? And there's silence, because the Brahmins, the priests, or the kings, or the yogis can't really answer this. And so in the 62 different arguments, he'll go into the eternalist view, saying that the soul is eternal and it's reborn and reborn and reborn. And he said that that's what some priests say, and that's what some recluses say, and that's what some ascetics say. But I know more than that. And in another discourse, he'll say, if one takes that view, that's a pernicious view. The eternalist view that there is a soul that continues over and over again. Why is that a pernicious or dangerous view? Because that means I'm not really going to have to perform this lifetime. I really don't have to be that moral this lifetime. I want to get drunk, I'm going to get drunk. I'm not going to worry about the consequences, the karma of that action, because whatever happens, I'll be coming back another lifetime. And I can fix it, whatever that karma was, in another lifetime. So even on a moral basis, one cannot accept the eternalist view, and you've never seen the soul, and you don't know who you were in your past lifetime. And then there is what is called the annihilationist view, saying that some people think nothing happens, that there is no soul at all, and there is no continuation of any type of life. And the Buddha rejects that, saying, how do you know that? Did your teacher tell you that? Where did you hear that there is nothing after death? And in fact, he goes on to the moralistic standpoint, saying, if you believe that, then there would be no punishment for you. You know, and then you would do what you want. You would rob people, you'd kill people, you would do what you wanted, because you knew however you died, and there would be no punishment. There would be no fruits of your actions. And then there is what is called the fortuitous originists. The fortuitous originists are the ones who believe that there is just chance. Things just happen. There is no order to anything. And the Buddha rejects that, saying again, even on a moralistic point of view, if you believe that, then you wouldn't have any incentive to be moral, and there would be just chaos in this world. And then there are what is called the eel wrigglers, people who say, well, it may be permanent, it may be eternal, and it may not be eternal. It may be both eternal and may not be both eternal. It may be neither eternal or it may not be neither. But which do you believe? Well, it could be any of those four, actually. And he calls those people the eel wrigglers. And then there are recombinations of the yogis who believe Well, the soul is partially eternal and partially non-eternal. And it's partially by accident things happen, and there is a chance of annihilationism happening. So he's like doing a recombination, and he shows all the recombinations. And this, again, is the genius. As he's expounding this, there is no writing material at that time. Writing has not been invented. And there is no substrata to write on at the time of the Buddha. The only people who have writing at that time are the Assyrians and the Arabs, who have learned tablet writing, you know, into the clay writing. But that has not come into India in the 6th century, before Common Era. So he's just expounding this. He didn't rehearse it. Okay, he's just expounding 62 different arguments, and that's called the Mahanidana Sutta. The Brahmajala Sutta, the discourse on the great net of wrong views of the soul. Okay, so now what is your question, Troy? Your question is, I'll tell you what your question is. Your question is, if there is no soul, and if there is no self, in fact, the Buddha is so derisive of the so-called self that he calls it no more substantial than a bubble on the foam of a wave out in the ocean. That's how insubstantial this thing that you call the self really is. So your question is, well, there is no self, he preaches, there is no soul, and I haven't even gotten into shunyata, which is the total void, the discourse on voidness or emptiness, that all phenomena are empty. This chair I'm sitting on is empty. This village or this town is empty. This earth is empty. That there is nothing except recombined entities, but there is no solidity and there is no self. Then your question is, what is it then that is reborn? If you say there is rebirth, what is it, Lord, that is reborn? And the Buddha has several ways of answering that, none of which are really satisfactory. Mainly because he does not want to get into speculative conversation. If I tell you what it is that is reborn, how will that help you to come out of illness, old age, and death? How will that help you to come out of suffering? I am here to teach suffering. I'm not here to give you interesting, pleasant mental sensations and speculations. So I'll give 3 examples of how he answers that question. One of the monks comes to him and says, Lord, I've been meditating and I've decided, if you don't declare to us now, is the soul eternal? Is the soul not eternal? Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is the soul infinite, or is it not infinite, or both non-infinite and infinite? I am going, and what is it that is reborn? Is the Tathagata himself reborn after death? Is he reborn in a happy state or an unhappy state in the after-death state? If you don't explain these things to me, I'm leaving the order. I'm going back to the householder's life. And the Buddha says, well, my good man, did I ever tell you join the order and I would tell you these things? No, I never did. And if you stayed in the order for the rest of your life, I would never explain those things to you. So give up those questions, number one. And he says, but let me give you a simile, good sir. Imagine, if you will, that there was a man who was shot with a poison arrow, and he's lying on the sidewalk, and he's dying, and the city people rush up to him and they say, stay where you are, my good man, don't move, we're going to call a physician, just stay where you are. And this man says, wait, before you call a physician, let me ask you, the man who shot me with the arrow, did he have a beard or was he clean shaven? And did he shoot me with an iron bow or with a wooden bow? That man would be asking speculative questions while in fact he was dying. And in the same way, you're asking me speculative questions when in fact you are dying today. And you want to come out of this cycle of birth and rebirth and death. So he gives another answer. He says, your karmas are your only belongings. This is a speech on the Kammasaka. Your karmas are your only belongings. Your karmas are your parents. Your karmas are your inheritance. Your karma are your progeny. Your karma is your destination and your refuge. Now, that's all he says. The scholars, the commentators then will say, well, this is how he identifies the self. If this is what this belongs to the self, we could say that the self is the karmas. And so they're speculating, or they're commenting and saying, well, maybe what I am is just a bundle of karmas that somehow move around in the universe. That's as best as they come up to. So really, he does not explain what it is. At one point, he will say that there is, when a woman is what he calls in season, and a man is in season, and a Gandharva appears in the woman's womb. And when you look up what is a Gandharva, it's been said that a Gandharva is a god, but when you break it down into the etymology, Gan means a grouping or a category, and Harva means to take. So it's a taken grouping has come into the womb, whatever a taken grouping is. So he will not go into that discussion of what is it, but whatever it is, it's transitory, it's permanent, impermanent, and it's a compounded entity, what this self is. And then there is dukkha, the third laksana, which is the third mark of existence. Dukkha means suffering, and this is the magnum opus, some would say, of the Buddha's teaching. What is suffering? The first noble truth. What is the origin or the cause of suffering? The second noble truth. The third noble truth. What is the cessation of suffering? And the fourth noble truth. What is the path to the cessation of suffering? Suffering is old age, illness, death, grieving, lamenting, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, not being with people you love, being with people you don't love. So he makes a whole list of what suffering is. Suffering is this endless cycle of death and rebirth. And what is the cause of suffering? The second noble truth, the cause of suffering is the desire itself. Desire leading to attachment. Desire for what? Desire for pleasant things of the eye. And remember, the aversion is the opposite coin of opposite side of the coin. You have desire and aversion on one coin, because you're clinging to aversion or you're clinging to desire. Desire, aversion for things of the eyes, desire for things of the ears, desire for the sense things, desire for the mental sensations, attachment to the body, desire for the body, for the things of the body, the material body, desire for feelings, desire for consciousness itself, desire for sankharas, for formations, desire for perceptions, and this clinging or attachment to those desires, that is the cause of suffering itself. And what is then the cessation of suffering is the release of those desires, letting go of the things that I want, that my eye tells me I want, or the things that my ears want, or the things that my ears don't want. Okay? And the non-attachment to the self itself, meaning non-attachment to physical form, non-attachment to feelings, pleasant or unpleasant feelings, non-attachment to consciousness itself, non-attachment to the programs themselves, non-attachment to the five parts of the self. And then what is the path to the cessation of suffering, which is the fourth noble truth. And there is where we come to the eightfold path. The eightfold path you've heard of to the cessation of suffering. And those are broken up into three groupings. The first grouping is called the wisdom grouping. So first we have what is called right view. And right view means that one understands impermanence, one understands no self, one understands suffering. One has a view, a knowledge of things as they are. And then the second, is what is called right intention or right thought. And right intention is relinquishment, letting go of things, letting go of all the attachments, and specifically letting go of cruelty and relinquishing cruelty and relinquishing violence. Okay? So that's the wisdom. This is the path to the cessation of suffering. One is now practicing the eightfold path, and that is the wisdom part of it. And then one moves into the moralities, and there are four moralities. So one practices right speech, as was said, meaning abstaining from false speech, abstaining from divisive speech, abstaining from harsh speech, and abstaining from babble. That would be called right speech. Right action, and so right action meaning that mentally, verbally, and physically, you would only be practicing the wholesome actions, okay, which are called the kusalas, which means that you would be, which are opposite the akusalas, the unwholesome actions, which are greed, hatred, and delusion. So you would be practicing the opposite of greed, which would be generosity, the opposite of hatred, which would be love, and the opposite of delusion, which would be knowledge. So that is what is considered right action, and you would be doing that mentally, and you would be doing it verbally, and you would be doing it physically. And so you would be doing that as the 5 precepts also. So mentally you would not be thinking, I could kill that person. Okay, as we've thought sometimes. That guy just cut me off. I could kill that person. I hope that person has a crash down the road. You know, so that's an unwholesome action, unwholesome mental action. All right, and then we have what is called right livelihood. And I'm sorry, I don't want to go through the whole list, but you understand, verbally you don't say, I hope you die. Verbally, you know, or you don't ram the guy, so you're trying to kill him with your vehicle, road rage. And then you go into right livelihood, and right livelihood is then, again, going by the 5 precepts. So you would not have a job that involves killing. You would not be a butcher, a soldier, a murderer for hire. Okay, and right, and you not taking what is not given, so you'd not be a bank robber. You would not earn your living by stealing. Sexual misconduct. You would not earn your living being, let's say, selling women or pornographer or in that regard. And now, what does the Buddha mean by sexual misconduct? That would be a question we could ask. And being the Buddha, he has the answer. Sexual misconduct means not having sex with one who is under the guardianship of another. So you not have sex with somebody else's wife because she's under the guardianship of your family and you. Okay, you not have sex with a child because she is under the guardianship of you, of a family, etc. You would not have sex with an animal. Okay, there would be no bestiality. This was a very sophisticated civilization, and so it's spelled out. You would not have sex with an animal because the animal will be under the guardianship of the owner, etc. So, so right livelihood would be going through the precepts. You would not be using speech in a way that is harmful, that is karmically incorrect, okay? And then you would not be dispensing intoxicants, okay? You'd not be a bartender, you'd not own a liquor store, all right? So that's right livelihood. Right effort then would be And that would be the 6th on the path, right effort. Right effort means that you would abandon unarisen, wholesome actions. Abandon unarisen, wholesome action. And that's one way he puts it. In the suttas, he says also, you will eradicate, you will annihilate them, and you will obliterate them. So he goes into different stages of what it means. Right effort means to abandon unarisen, unwholesome action. And we defined what are the unwholesome actions: greed, hatred, and delusion. And you would then abandon already arisen unwholesome actions, and you would encourage unarisen wholesome actions, and you would maintain already arisen wholesome actions. That would be what is considered right effort. And then we go into right awareness, which is what the Mahasatipatthana Sutta is about, and that is what we work with when you come to my yoga class. We work with the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is awareness itself, the foundations of awareness based on the breathing, and he discusses the Anapana, the breathing techniques, just like they do in pranayama. But it's quite different how the yogis describe pranayama in holding the breath, in all the various kapilapatis and raising kundalini through breath pranayama control and manipulating breath, etc. The Buddha, when he talks about pranayama, he is saying that one is aware one is breathing in long, one is aware one is breathing in short. One is aware one is breathing in through the left nostril. One is aware one is breathing in through the right nostril. It's a process of awareness, awareness, not a process of manipulation as the yogis are using it to clear the body, to purify the body, etc. The Buddha's teaching is about awareness, not about purification through physical actions like that. And so we have the breath as the foundation for the 4 awarenesses. Awareness of the body at the deepest level. So he says, you should be able to know your spleen. You should be able to know your kidney. You should be able to know your liver. You should be able to know the veins, the bones. He's saying, know the body at the deepest level. Not just you read an anatomy book, but you have actually experienced your liver. You actually were your liver at some point. Through direct knowledge, you know the body as it is, so that at one point you say, ah, this is the body. I understand. This is the body. And so when we're doing Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, you start going deeper into the sensations, not just aches or pains, whatever you feel on the interior right now. You're feeling certain sensations. Maybe you're a little stiff in the back from sitting so long, or maybe, you know, something's happening in your neck from... Okay, so you're feeling these internal sensations, but at the deepest level. And as we go to this particular spiritual center, Agape International Spiritual Center, when this particular pastor that we see, Reverend Michael Beckwith, says, feel it in your bones, he means that literally. It's not a figure of speech. When he says open your heart, he means physically feel it at the deepest levels on the physical level. So one is first knowing things as they are in the body, then one knows things as the feelings themselves at the deepest levels of sensations. Not feelings, I don't mean to use the word feelings like sad, happy. One knows that because those are mental sensations. The word really Vedana means sensations. So then one knows the sensations at the deepest level, as I'm describing, through the Vipassana practice, the insight practice. And then one knows the states of the mind, as they're called. The states of the mind are passing through, as we described in the yoga class, sluggish state of mind, alert state of mind. Now I'm getting sleepy after this long lecture state of mind, right? Whatever is the state of mind, you're aware at any moment what is the state of mind. And then finally, you're saying to yourself, I understand the states of mind. but at the deepest level you have understood it. What are these states of mind? In this, as impermanent, as having no intrinsic reality, and as being the cause of suffering when one attaches to one particular state of mind or tries to avert another state of mind. So the practice is very deep. Sure, I know, I woke up this morning, I was feeling really sluggish. I got it, that's the state of mind. No, you must go deeper into what is a state of mind itself. What is the condition of a state of mind, and then what are the phenomena or the objects or the things in the mind, and these are all these little blah, 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 blah. Last week I did this, she said this to me last week. Last year I remember going over there, you know, that was painful, no, that was pleasant. Next week I have this really great thing I'm going to, I'm afraid next week the check's not coming in, you know, boom. So it's these things that are going on, time displacement, and so when we're breathing in the yoga class, the breath is what brings us to the present moment. So the Buddha says that you'll understand when you stretch out the arm is stretching out. When you bring in the arm is coming in. When you're turning to the right, the head is turning to the right. When you're turning to the left, the head is turning to the left. So you're understanding at the deepest level mental states, objects or things in the mind. You're understanding the feelings, and you're understanding at the deepest level the body itself, at the organic level. And then, this is it, we're moving to the end. Are you still with me? Okay, all right. We come to the eighth of the eightfold path, which is called samadhi. And samadhi is defined by the yogis in different ways through Raja Yoga, which means the total union of Brahman and Atman, and one then is released into this union, whatever that ecstatic state is that one is released into. But in the samadhis that the Buddha described, they are the concentrations or the absorptions, and there are 8 absorptions that he describes. These are meditative states. So the first, and they're called the 4 form absorptions, and then the 4 formless absorptions. So the first is what is called sustained and applied thought. Okay, and we've all experienced this. Sometimes you're taking a few minutes and you're just so fixated on something, and you think about it and go like, wow, that was great. You know, I was just there with that one thought, and it was so you're feeling some happiness or some kind of from being in a sustained thought, and that is a type of an absorption, but you just release that if you feel that, and then you move into pure concentration. Now you may use your breath as a concentrative tool. You may use some what's called a kasina. There are 40 concentration objects that the Buddha prescribes, like staring at a candle or staring at a pool of water or a rock or a color, etc. And that develops one pointedness, and one develops a very high kind of state, like, whoa, I was just into this one thing so deep, and that felt so amazing, just being there and not having all that little stuff going on. But one releases that, then you don't get hung up in that particular absorption, and then you come to a very rapturous or blissful absorption, what you've heard people describe as unification of the mind, or ecstasy, or joy, or peace, these large states of mind that are very pleasurable. And the Buddha says you experience that, and then you don't get attached to that. You release that. And you go on to the next absorption, which is joy and bliss, but without any, let me go back. He says you come to a state of equanimity with joy. That's the third. It's a state of equanimity, but there's a high level of joy or ecstasy or bliss with that, but it's called equanimity with joy. And then the fourth stage is equanimity without joy. You're just equanimous. There is no being happy about it at that point. Now you release that. You don't want to get attached to any state of mind, understanding the true nature of states, of all phenomena, right? impermanent, non-intrinsic, and resulting in suffering if one is trying to hold on to them as a permanent fixture. So you release that, you go into what is called the formless states, and the first formless state is called coming to the base of infinity of space. Einstein called it space-time, the Buddha calls it space. Now you're moving into a formless state. You're no longer dependent on the body. There's a very subtle connection to the body, and at that point you're starting to release anything that has to do with time or measurement or distance, and people gain supernatural powers and they're able to go to the moon, or they're able to come visit you. There's no time or space situation. But you have to release that, as wonderful, amazing as that is, because if you get hung up into that, you will release the body, you will attain a level of a deva or devi, you will enter into a celestial body of light. It's called a body of light and mind, the body of these celestial beings. And they come and visit the Buddha throughout these narratives, and they seek his teachings as well, because they understand, I've come to this level, but I'm attached to this, and I'm realizing it's starting to dissipate, like all formations. Even this beautiful celestial place I'm in is starting to break apart and dissolve. So please help me, what should I do at this point? And they come to him late at night when all the monks and nuns are asleep, and they ask his advice. And so one releases that, detaches from that, understanding at the deepest level, and then moving into the next level, which is called the base of infinity of knowledge, of consciousness, that is, I should say consciousness, that one can know everything there is to know. With the ears, with the eyes, with the taste, one knows everything one can know through the consciousness, through the six consciousnesses. And then one releases that, because you don't want to get clinging or attached to that, and then one comes to what is called the base of infinity of no thing, and one truly understands the concept of anatta, that there is no thing. And so then one could possibly walk through the wall, because there is no thing here that we call a solidity of a wall necessarily. And as pleasant or as amazing as that is, one has to release that, not get attached, because you'll get stuck on that level, and then you'll have to come back around again. So then one comes, releasing that, comes to the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And that is a place where there's just a little bit of the perceiver of that experience is still there. You're no longer in a formless state, but there is a perception going on. Something is perceiving. Not necessarily a perceiver, but a perception is perceiving. So let the mind be blown a little bit here. Don't solidify. Whatever that means, I have no idea, because I've never been there. Okay? But as amazing as that is, one cannot get stuck in that amazing place. And one relinquishes that, one detaches from that, and then one enters into the state of nibbana, the state of liberation. Nirvana in Sanskrit, nibbana in Pali. And from the root word nirva, which means to not to blow, literally not to blow. And when the commentators explain what does he mean when he says nirvana, not to blow, it means you are no longer blowing on the embers of desire. You're no longer heating up desire. In the great discourse on the fire, he says, monks, your eyes are on fire, your ears are on fire, your mouth is on fire, your smell is on fire, your skin is on fire. This is the cause of desire, is this wanting to consume whatever it is, visual consumption, audio consumption, tactile consumption. And so this means that you have cooled down to where there is no more blowing on the fires of desire, which again in the chain of dependent causation are going to lead to the clinging, the gestation, the birth, the death, and then the cycle continuing. Now what happens after that? I have no idea. You are a liberated person at that point. The Buddha describes 4 stages. He says there's the Sotapanna, which is one who hears the Dhamma as we are hearing the Dhamma tonight, and one who has given up the view of the self, thinking that there is a self, that there is an Atman, a soul, as the yogis and as the Hindus are believing and practicing. One has given up rites and rituals, and you see in a lot of shamanic or even the Hindu or the Western religions, there is a lot of ceremonies and rituals. In the teachings of the Buddha, there are no rituals. Now, if you go to Japan or Korea or Burma, you're going to see this was the Buddha's birthday. We're having a big birthday party. This was this time. The Buddha had never said anything about observances or rituals. That's what he was totally against, was rituals. So when they asked him, what should we do with your remnants when we cremate you? What should we do with you after that? He says, bury the bones, bury anything that's left, the relics, where no one can find them, because I am not to be worshipped. Okay, the Dhamma is to be worshipped. The teachings are to be worshipped, not the person. Okay? The Buddha is just an honorific term. It's like the president. We had this person as a president, then that person. He's just the Buddha. In this, prior to him, there was Kassapa the Buddha. There will be a Maitreya Buddha coming, but he's a nobody. He's a nothing. And we have to understand this idea of no thing just by one anecdote real quickly, and then we'll break it up soon, is that at a certain point the Buddha and the monks hear that one of the monks who has been meditating in a cave in some secluded place has died. And so they decide to go up there, find the body, and cremate the body. And they're looking everywhere in this area where he should be, where the body should be, and they cannot find the body. And while they're searching, the Buddha points up in the sky and he says, look, monks, you see that black wisp of smoke up there? Well, that is Mara, death. Death itself is looking for this monk, but death cannot find this monk. Nothing exists anymore. No body, no self, void, whatever that means. Wherever we go, that's speculative. To speculate on what happens, how does that help me come out of old age, illness, death, attachments, impermanence, all of that? So that is the teachings of the Buddha as much as we can do in 2 hours. And I try to infuse a little bit by contrast what are the teachings of Hinduism, and I think you understand now the major differences, and they are major. Even though there are some similarities, there are major differences here. And I think I've answered most of the questions. So unless anyone has a question, you want to stay another minute, but I usually do answer most of the questions. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you.